The DNA report glows on my screen. Proof my entire life is a lie. My father's footsteps pound up the stairs, his eyes locking onto my laptop like a predator spotting prey. I slam the lid shut, but it's too late. He knows I've found the missing child flyer, the one with my face on it. The doorknob rattles. He's not here to fix a leak. He's here to silence me. A stranger kicks down the door, lunging at my father with a knife. I swing my camera, hard. The investigator crumples, but his notebook flutters open, revealing a name scrawled in blood-red ink. Vance. My hands shake as I grab it, but my father's voice cuts through the chaos. Sarah, we need to leave. Now. His keys jingle as he drops them, and one lands at my feet, stamped with a storage unit number. A second life, a second name, and I'm holding the proof. The pixelated scan of the 1994 flyer shimmered on the laptop screen, its edges frayed and yellowed even in digital form. Sarah traced the jagged scar on the infant's forehead, a tiny, crescent-shaped mark identical to the one hidden beneath her own hairline. The air in the attic smelled of mothballs and damp insulation thick enough to coat her tongue. Below her, the muffled rhythm of her father's hammer against a loose floorboard vibrated through the joists, a steady, domestic heartbeat that now sounded like a countdown. She dragged the police department's genetic breakdown into the split-view window. The percentages aligned with a clinical, terrifying precision. Columns of markers snapped into place, bridging the gap between Sarah Miller and the stolen child from Charleston. Her pulse thudded against her eardrums. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, illuminating the cracked plastic of the storage bin where she'd found the original paper, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Great Expectations. Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She gripped the edge of the desk until the wood bit into her palms. The woman downstairs had bandaged her scraped knees for 24 years, yet the data on the screen suggested every bandage covered a lie. She minimized the window as the door handle turned. The metallic click echoed like a hammer cocking. Sarah? Dinner's drying out. Her mother's voice drifted up the stairs, chirpy and thin. Coming, Mom, Sarah said, her voice cracking. She stood, her legs heavy as lead, and shoved the flyer deep into her pocket. The paper crinkled, a sharp, accusing sound in the cramped space. She retreated to her own apartment that evening, the weight of the discovery pressing against her chest like a physical stone. The radiator in the corner of her living room clanked with a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat, a sound that usually grounded her but now felt like a warning. Sarah sat at her desk, the glow of her dual monitors casting a ghostly blue light across her face. She began the audit whisper, her voice a faint, melodic hum. C42, D109. Row 4, 113. Unfiled. She opened the Charleston police database she had spent weeks bypassing. The screen flickered as she compared her DNA profile, a sequence she'd obtained via a private lab, against the cold case records of a girl named Amanda Vance. The numbers didn't just suggest a match. They demanded it. The probability of a mismatch was practically zero. Sarah felt a cold sweat break across her neck. Every memory of her childhood, the reflective silences imposed by Thomas, the triple washing of Martha's hands, suddenly shifted into a new, predatory context. She wasn't their daughter. She was their prize. The silence of the apartment was shattered by the sudden, heavy thud of a deadbolt sliding home. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She hadn't heard the stairs groan. She hadn't heard the count. Thomas Miller stood in her doorway, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his eyes unblinking and wide. He held a toolbox in his left hand, the metal handle creaking under his grip. 1, 2, 3, 14. He whispered, finishing his ritualistic count of the steps. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked at the monitors. "The sink in the kitchen has a drip, Sarah," he said, his voice a smooth, terrifyingly patient baritone. "We can't have waste. Efficiency is the hallmark of a disciplined home." Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the laptop lid, her fingers fumbling with the plastic. "I didn't call about a leak, Dad. It's late." Thomas stepped further into the room, the smell of cedar wood and old paper trailing after him. He didn't move toward the kitchen. Instead, he drifted toward the desk, his gaze fixed on the glowing screens. Sarah felt the air grow thin. She tried to block his view with her body, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You've been spending a lot of time in the dark lately," Thomas remarked, his tone conversational yet edged with a steel trap sharpness. "A lack of focus leads to errors, and we know how we feel about errors, don't we?" He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the keyboard. Sarah could see the fine hairs on his knuckles. She imagined him counting the pixels on the screen, calculating the exact moment her loyalty had fractured. The tension in the room was a physical cord, stretched to the point of snapping when the front door, which Thomas had left unlocked, burst inward with a violent crash. A man in a rumpled charcoal suit charged into the room. This was James Bennett, though Sarah didn't know his name yet. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since the 90s, his face a map of grief and caffeine. He didn't hesitate. He saw Thomas standing over Sarah and lunged. "Where is she, Miller?" Bennett roared, his voice like grinding gravel. He tackled Thomas, the toolbox clattering to the floor and spilling heavy iron wrenches across the hardwood. Sarah screamed, the sound lost in the grunt of impact. Bennett had Thomas pinned against the wall, his forearm pressed against Thomas's throat. Thomas's face turned a mottled purple, his eyes bulging, but he didn't strike back. He looked at Sarah, a silent, instructional plea in his gaze, the look of a teacher waiting for a student to provide the right answer. Sarah's mind raced. This man, this intruder, was hurting her father. The logic of 24 years of conditioning overrode the data on her screen. She saw the heavy professional camera on her desk, a solid 5-pound block of glass and metal. She grabbed the strap, swung it with every ounce of terror-fueled strength she possessed, and connected with the back of the intruder's head. There was a sickening thwack, like a baseball hitting a wet rug. Bennett crumpled instantly, his body sliding down the wall and hitting the floor with a heavy, final thud. Silence rushed back into the room, punctuated only by the rhythmic clank of the radiator. Thomas slumped against the wall, gasping for air, his hand clutching his throat. Sarah stood over the fallen man, the camera still swinging from her hand, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I saved you," she whispered, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. She had acted to preserve the only world she knew, hoping that this act of violence would balance the scales, would make her the good daughter again. She looked at Thomas, expecting a thank you, a hug, a sign of paternal warmth. Thomas stood up slowly, adjusting his tie with 3 precise tugs. He didn't look at her with gratitude. He looked at her with a cold, clinical assessment. "He's a private investigator, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice returning to its steady, instructional cadence. "He's been hounding the school board for months. You shouldn't have brought him here." Sarah froze. "I didn't bring him here. I don't even know who he is." "You left a trail," Thomas said, stepping over the unconscious man as if he were a pile of laundry. "Your curiosity is a leak, Sarah, and leaks must be plugged. He reached into his pocket to retrieve his phone, but as he pulled it out, a small brass key caught on the fabric and fell to the floor. It landed with a bright, metallic ring, sliding across the wood until it tapped against the intruder's shoe. Sarah looked at the key. It was etched with a number, 402, and below that, a logo for Safekeep Storage. "What's that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Thomas didn't answer. He looked at the key, then at Sarah, and for the first time in her life, she saw a flicker of something that wasn't control. It was predatory intent. He reached for the key, but Sarah was faster. She lunged, snatched the key from the floor, and backed away toward the door. In the same motion, she reached into the unconscious investigator's pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. She didn't think. She just acted. The data-driven part of her brain told her that if she stayed, she would be reflected into non-existence. "Sarah," Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, "give me the key. We are going to sit down and discuss the hierarchy of a family. 1, 2. Sarah didn't wait for 3. She turned and bolted out the door, the investigator's notebook pressed against her ribs and the brass key biting into her palm. She ran down the 3 flights of stairs, her heart a frantic drumbeat. She reached the street, the humid Charleston air clinging to her skin like a wet shroud. She headed for her old sedan, her fingers fumbling for her car keys, but as she reached the driver's side door, she stopped. All 4 tires were shredded, not just flat, but sliced with long, surgical precision. The rubber hung in ribbons, the metal rims resting on the asphalt. A cold realization washed over her. Thomas hadn't just arrived to fix a leak. He had arrived to ensure she couldn't leave. She looked up at her apartment window. The blue light of her monitors was still visible, but a shadow crossed the glass. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Martha. "Sarah, dear." Her mother's voice was thin and chirpy, but there was a tremor of frantic energy beneath the surface. "We've moved the anniversary dinner to 6 o'clock. Thomas says you're having a bit of a stressful evening. Come home. I'm making the pot roast you like. I've already washed the plates 3 times. Everything is clean, Sarah. We can make you clean too." Sarah ended the call without speaking. The triple wash was no longer a quirk. It was a threat of erasure. She looked at the storage key in her hand. 402. She knew the Safekeep facility. It was an industrial eyesore on the edge of the city, a place where people hid the things they couldn't fit into their lives. She pulled up a rideshare app, her fingers flying across the screen. A car was 2 minutes away. She stood in the shadows of a nearby oak tree, watching her apartment door. She expected Thomas to emerge, to start his rhythmic count as he searched the street. But the door remained closed. That was worse. It meant he was already moving to the next phase of the lesson. The rideshare, a nondescript silver SUV, pulled to the curb. Sarah slid into the back seat, the smell of artificial pine and stale cigarettes hitting her. "Safekeep Storage on Industrial Way," she said, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. As the car pulled away, Sarah opened the investigator's notebook. The handwriting was cramped, the ink smeared by sweat. She flipped through pages of dates, license plate numbers, and names. Then she saw it. A hand-drawn map of a rural area in West Virginia, circled in red. Beside it, a single word: nursery. The car hummed along the highway, the streetlights outside flashing by like a strobe light. Sarah clutched the brass key. She was a master of digital security, a woman who lived in the clean, logical world of spreadsheets and checksums. But as the city lights faded into the dark industrial outskirts, she realized she was entering a world where the data was written in blood, and the only security was silence. The safekeep facility was a fortress of corrugated steel and buzzing fluorescent lights. Sarah paid the driver and stepped out into the biting wind. The facility felt sterile, a place designed for objects, not people. She walked past the rows of orange doors, her footsteps echoing against the concrete. Unit 402 was at the very end of a long, dimly lit hallway. Sarah inserted the key. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clack. She pulled the door up. The screech of metal on metal set her teeth on edge. Inside, the unit was packed with filing cabinets and cardboard boxes, all meticulously labeled in Thomas's precise, architectural handwriting. Sarah stepped inside and pulled a string on a bare light bulb. The yellow glow revealed a life's work of secrets. She ignored the boxes labeled school board and financials. She went straight for a small, locked metal box on the bottom shelf. Using a heavy screwdriver she found on a nearby workbench, she pried the lid open. Inside was a thick manila folder. The first document was a medical record, but there was no hospital letterhead. It was a handwritten log, signed by M. Miller, R.N. Patient, infant female. Weight, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Delivery, private residence. Condition, stable. Sarah's breath hitched. There was no birth certificate, just a nursing log. She flipped the page and found a series of photographs. They weren't family photos. They were surveillance shots. A woman, Linda Vance, pushing a stroller in a park. A man, presumably the father, loading groceries into a car. Each photo was time-stamped, months before the kidnapping. They had stalked them, They had hunted her biological family like prey, selecting the perfect child to fill the void in their own sterile lives. A sudden, violent slam echoed through the hallway. The heavy steel door of the storage unit crashed down, the bottom seal hitting the concrete with a bone-jarring thud. Sarah lunged for the handle, but she heard the distinct click of a heavy padlock being snapped into place from the outside. The light bulb flickered and died. Sarah was plunged into a total, suffocating darkness. The air in the unit was cold, locked at a biting 52 degrees, and the smell of old paper and dust began to coat her lungs. "Help!" she screamed, pounding her fists against the corrugated steel. "Is anyone there?" No one answered. But she heard something, a rhythmic tapping against the metal door. Tap, 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 the 4 count. It wasn't Thomas. "I know you have the files, Sarah," a voice said from the other side. It was cold, mechanical, devoid of any paternal pretension. "Your father wants them back. He says you're having a breakdown. He says you're not well." Sarah backed away from the door, her hands searching the darkness until they hit the cold metal of a shelving unit. Her heart was a frantic animal in her chest. She remembered the notebook, the nursery in West Virginia. "He's lying," Sarah yelled. "He stole me. I have the records." "The records don't exist if you don't exist," the voice replied. Then the sound of a circular saw erupted, a high-pitched shriek that tore through the silence. A spark showered through the gap at the bottom of the door, illuminating the unit in jagged, terrifying bursts of orange light. The mercenary was cutting his way in. Sarah scrambled to the back of the unit. She saw a small rectangular vent high on the back wall, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. She grabbed a heavy metal chair and stacked it on top of a filing cabinet. The saw finished its first cut. The metal door groaned as the mercenary began to pry it upward. Sarah climbed. Her fingers gripped the edges of the ventilation shaft, the cold metal biting into her skin. She pulled herself up, her muscles screaming, her breath coming in jagged sobs. She squeezed her shoulders through the narrow opening just as the storage door was wrenched open. A beam of a high-powered flashlight swept across the unit, illuminating the empty space where she had stood seconds before. "She's in the vents," the man shouted. Sarah didn't look back. She crawled through the dark, cramped shaft, the smell of galvanized steel and dead spiders filling her nose. She reached an exterior grate and kicked it with both feet. It gave way with a metallic clatter, and she tumbled out onto the damp grass behind the facility. She didn't stop running until she reached a small public park 3 blocks away. She collapsed onto a wooden bench, her body shaking so hard she could barely breathe. She realized she had left her phone in the storage unit, a tactical error that felt like a death sentence. But then she realized, if she didn't have her phone, they couldn't track her GPS. She pulled the manila folder from under her shirt. She had kept the evidence. Under the dim glow of a park streetlight, Sarah looked at the surveillance photos again. She saw the face of the woman who should have raised her. Linda Vance. The woman looked haunted even then. Sarah felt a surge of something she had never allowed herself to feel. Rage. Not the cold, calculated anger of Thomas, but a hot, righteous fury. She had been a project, a masterpiece to be curated. She stood up, her legs heavy but steady. She needed a phone. She needed to hear the voice of the woman in the photograph. She walked to a nearby 24-hour gas station, the neon "open" sign buzzing with a predatory hum. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax. She walked to the counter, her eyes fixed on the display of burner phones. "I need that one," she said, pointing to a basic flip phone, "and a $20 minute card." The clerk, a teenager with bored eyes, rung her up without a word. Sarah stepped into the shadows of the parking lot and activated the phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the numbers she had memorized from the investigator's notebook. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" A woman's voice, thin and fragile, like glass that had been cracked and glued back together. "Is this Linda Vance?" Sarah asked. There was a long silence. "Who is this? Is this about the girl?" "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice cracking. I have a mark on my shoulder, a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon, and a scar on my hairline." On the other end of the line, she heard a sharp intake of breath. Then the sound of a locket being flicked open and shut. Click, clack, click, clack. "Amanda?" Linda whispered. "Is it really you?" "I think so," Sarah said, tears finally blurring her vision. "I think I've been living a lie for 25 years. Where are you? I'll come get you. I'll call the police. "No!" Sarah hissed. "Don't call the police. The people who took me. They have influence. They've already told the police I'm crazy. If you call them, they'll take me back. I need to get to you. I'm in Charleston. I'm coming to the address in the notebook." "Hurry," Linda said, her voice strengthening. "Please, just hurry." Sarah ended the call, a sense of hope blooming in her chest. She had a destination. She had a mother. This was the smart move. This was the logical path to safety. She turned to leave the gas station, her mind already calculating the miles to the state line. But as she stepped toward the road, a black SUV pulled into the lot, blocking her path. The driver's side door opened. Thomas Miller stepped out. He wasn't holding a toolbox this time. He was holding a tablet, the screen glowing with a map. "You forgot your phone, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the empty parking lot. "But you didn't forget your habits. You always use the same rideshare account. You always go to the same gas station when you're stressed. You're very predictable. It's one of your most endearing qualities. Sarah backed away, her heart plummeting. How did you find me? I didn't find you, Sarah. We found you. From the passenger side, Martha stepped out. She was wearing her nursing scrubs, her hands covered in thin latex gloves. She looked at Sarah with a mixture of pity and resolve. We've already called the station, honey, Martha said, her voice a soothing, terrifying coo. We told them you stole the family silver and had a psychotic break. We told them you were heading for the Vance house. There's a warrant out for your arrest, Sarah. For your own protection. Thomas held up the tablet. This is a digital psychiatric hold, signed by a judge who owes me a very large favor. It says you are a danger to yourself and others. Anything you say, any evidence you provide, will be treated as a symptom of your illness. Sarah looked at the two people who had raised her. They had weaponized the very world she thought she understood. They had turned the law, the data, and her own identity against her. You're not my parents, Sarah said, her voice cold. We are the only parents you have, Thomas replied, stepping toward her. And now, it's time for a very long period of reflection. He lunged for her, but Sarah was no longer the girl who sat in silence for 6 hours. She turned and ran toward a parked maintenance truck, the keys still in the ignition. She jumped in, slammed the door, and floored the accelerator. The truck roared to life, tires screaming as she peeled out of the lot. She saw Thomas in the rearview mirror, his face a mask of cold fury as he ran back to his SUV. The chase began on the winding, fog-shrouded roads of rural West Virginia. Sarah pushed the heavy truck to its limit, the engine groaning under the strain. Behind her, the headlights of Thomas's SUV hung like the eyes of a predator. He rammed her. The impact sent a bone-jarring shudder through the truck, the smell of burning rubber and hot metal filling the cab. Sarah gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. She entered a construction zone, the road narrowing between orange barrels and skeletal steel frames. Thomas rammed her again, harder this time. The truck swerved, skidding on the loose gravel. Sarah lost control. The heavy vehicle plowed into a sand barrier, the airbag exploding with a deafening bang and a cloud of white powder. Sarah slumped against the seat, her head ringing, the world tilting on its axis. She tried to open the door, but it was jammed against the barrier. The SUV pulled up alongside her. Thomas stepped out, his movement slow and deliberate. He walked to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass. 1, 2, 3, 4. The lesson is over, Sarah, he said, his voice amplified by the silence of the construction site. You failed the final exam. Now, we go home. He reached through the shattered window and unlocked the door. He pulled her out of the wreck, his grip on her arm like a vice. Sarah was too weak to fight, her body a mass of bruises and exhaustion. He drove her back to the Victorian house in Charleston, the perfect home built on a foundation of stolen lives. Martha was waiting on the porch, her hands scrubbing together in a frantic, wet rhythm. They took her to her childhood bedroom. The windows had been fitted with subtle, decorative bars. The door had a new, industrial-grade lock. We're going to help you get well, Sarah, Martha said, tucking a blanket around her as if she were a child again. We found a lovely retreat in the mountains. No phones, no computers, just peace. You kidnapped me, Sarah whispered. We saved you, Thomas corrected, standing in the doorway. We took you from a woman who couldn't even keep track of you for 60 seconds. We gave you a life of discipline, education, and purpose. You should be thanking us. He closed the door. The click of the lock was the finality of a grave. Sarah lay in the dark, the smell of lavender and mothballs suffocating her. But her mind was still working. She was a master of digital security, and she had one final card to play. Before she had left her apartment, she had initiated a background upload of all her findings to a secure cloud server, programmed to send a link to the Charleston Police Department and the local news stations if she didn't enter a safe code every 12 hours. She looked at the smart security panel on the wall of her room, a high-tech system Thomas had installed to protect the house. He thought he was the master of his environment. But he didn't realize that the environment was made of data. Sarah pulled a small, hidden laptop from beneath a loose floorboard, a backup she had kept since she was 16. She connected to the house's Wi-Fi. It took her 3 minutes to bypass the firewall. She didn't call for help, She triggered the emergency fire protocol. The house erupted in a cacophony of sirens and flashing red lights. The smart locks on the doors, designed to fail open in the event of a fire, snapped back. Sarah bolted from the room. She ran down the stairs, past the kitchen where Martha was screaming, and into the basement. She found the original flyer, the one she had hidden in the joists, and the manila folder she had snatched from the truck. She met Thomas in the smoke-filled hallway. He was holding a heavy wrench, his face distorted by the red strobe lights. "You're destroying everything," he roared. "I'm ending the lie, Thomas," she said, her voice steady and cold. "I've already sent the files. The police aren't coming for a crazy girl. They're coming for a kidnapper." In that moment, the facade finally broke. Thomas didn't look like a principal anymore. He looked like a thief. "I paid her," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the sirens. "Martha, she was the nurse. She told me which families were unfit. She helped me pick you. It was a transaction, Sarah. I bought you a better life." Sarah looked at him with a profound, hollow clarity. Her entire upbringing had been a purchase, an acquisition. The front door was kicked open. A group of police officers, led by a young man with a checklist, Officer David Scott, swarmed into the house. "We have the digital upload," Scott shouted, his voice echoing through the chaos. "Thomas Miller, Martha Miller, you are under arrest for the abduction of Amanda Vance." Sarah watched as the handcuffs were clicked onto Thomas's wrists. He didn't fight. He just stared at her, his lips moving in a silent, frantic count. 1, 2, 3. He never reached 14. The morning sun was a pale, cold gold as Sarah stood on the driveway of the Miller house. The sirens had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of a neighborhood waking up. She looked at the house, the beautiful, oppressive cage, and felt nothing but a vast, empty space where her identity used to be. She took a taxi to the address in the notebook, a small, neatly kept house in a quiet suburb of Charleston. There were no bars on the windows, no security cameras, just a porch with a single, silent wind chime. Sarah walked up the steps. Her heart was beating fast, but for the first time, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of anticipation. She knocked on the door. A woman opened it. She was older than in the photographs, her hair gray and her eyes weary. But when she saw Sarah, she stopped. She reached up and touched the crescent-shaped scar on Sarah's hairline. "Amanda?" she whispered. Sarah looked at the woman who had spent 25 years waiting for a ghost. She felt the weight of the Miller name fall away, a heavy, suffocating coat she finally didn't have to wear. "My name is Amanda," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And I'm home." The wind chime on the porch finally caught a breeze, releasing a single clear note that echoed into the morning air. The silence was over. The data was reconciled. The girl who was lost had finally been found.